Thank you all for joining us today. For those whom I don't know, I'm Brandee Butler. I'm the CEO of the Institute for Human Rights in Business as of November. And I'm excited to welcome you all to this conversation today. First, I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping. It's important to know this conversation is being live streamed and recorded. We will publish and share the recording on our website and our socials. And we invite you to use the chat function to post any questions you have throughout, and we will do our best to feed them into the conversation. So I think we have people joining from countries all over the world. I'm coming to you from Barcelona, Spain, where I live. And I mention that not to brag, but because it shapes how I think about the issues we're going to talk about today and how I'm showing up and engaging in this conversation. Because here in Spain, you can actually see the transition unfolding. You see renewable infrastructure going up, vigorous debates around land use, housing, jobs, and energy prices are happening in real time. And you see very clearly that the climate transition isn't an abstract idea. It's local, it's visceral, and it's human. And you're probably feeling that wherever you're based as well. Globally, we've reached a turning point. In 2025, renewables overtook coal as the world's leading source of electricity, which is a historic milestone, signaling one of the largest economic transformations of our time, with implications for capital, workforce transitions, industrial policy, and competitiveness. But energy is only one piece of the story. Disruption is happening across multiple sectors all at once: mining, manufacturing, transportation, construction, and agriculture, among others, which means the question is no longer whether the transition will happen, but how and who will benefit. When transitions are poorly designed, delayed, or disconnected from people's realities, the consequences are very real. Community resistance, stalled projects, reputational and financial risk, and in some cases, lasting harms. And that's where the idea of a just transition becomes so essential. At its simplest, just transition is about getting this change right, recognizing that urgent climate action and people's livelihoods are not competing priorities, and that if we fail to address both of them together, we ultimately fail at both. And business has a central role to play here. Companies are not bystanders in this moment. They are the system shapers. Decisions about investment, procurement, employment, and exit will often determine whether transitions succeed or fail. And too often, the conversation centers only around managing risk. So with this new IHRB report, what it shows is something much more ambitious, and I hope you will agree, something more hopeful. It tells the stories of transformative business models that demonstrate that sustainability can create value and not merely manage risk. The report draws on examples from Brazil, from Australia, India, and Spain, and looks at the governance, financing, and sequencing choices that help make just transitions work in practice, and shows that social impact and business performance can reinforce each other. So you'll hear a lot more about this shortly, including insights from business practitioners across sectors who are actively trying to implement just transition approaches in their operations. But first, I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Brazil's UN Climate Champion for Industry, Ioschpe. For those who are less familiar with the role, a UN Climate Champion is essentially a bridge between global climate commitments and the real economy. They're mandated by the UN to help translate COP outcomes into action, and particularly by mobilizing private sector leadership and accelerating implementation on the ground. Every year, the COP host country appoints a climate champion for a 2-year term. And so we're honored to be joined today by Brazil's champion. As many of you know, under Brazil's leadership, there's been a very deliberate effort to position COP30 as a turning point in moving the global climate community from 3 decades of negotiation towards a focus squarely focused on delivery. COP30 was framed as an implementation COP, and while the formal outcome sent very mixed messages, there were some important advances, including the agreement on the Belém Action Mechanism, which elevates just transitions within the UN climate architecture. Dan, you've been at the center of these conversations, working closely with industry leaders on what implementation actually looks like in practice. And so I want to first extend a warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. And I know that you need to leave at, I believe, 20 past the hour for another important engagement. So let's just get into it. Can you share with us what signals you think businesses should be taking from the COP30 outcomes, and whether businesses showed up to COP in the ways that you and the presidency hoped.
Very good. Hope you're hearing me well, and good day. I'm speaking from São Paulo, not from Barcelona. So, Brandee, you are naturally in a better position than I am. And thanks, Haley, as well for the invitation. Great to be here with you. I think COP30 demonstrated that the global climate action agenda is focused on implementation, as you already mentioned. The collective work in Belém, done by all of us, marked the fundamental shift in this approach. I believe we successfully showed that non-state actors, cities, businesses, investors, communities, indigenous people are not just observers or advocates. They are really essential partners in this new era of implementation. Building on more than a decade of initiatives since COP21, we had this chance to revamp the climate action agenda into a single coordinated framework that emphasizes implementing and achieving tangible relevant results. Today, there is 482 initiatives that mobilize a coordinated large-scale action. At the same time, the success of the action agenda, as you already pointed out, is really about people. Accelerating implementation requires protecting livelihoods and ensuring that climate action creates durable benefits for current and future generations. We are already seeing how this approach is speeding up implementation across different sectors. To give a few examples, in the energy sector, members of the Utilities for Net Zero Alliance, they are really investing over $1 trillion from now until 2030 to accelerate renewable energy generation, transmission, distribution, modernizing power grids around the world. Similarly, governments came together to accelerate the sustainable development of a forest economy under the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, the so-called TFFFF, which was backed initially at COP30 by $6.5 billion, and hopefully will grow up to the intended more than $100 billion, allowing this change on how we see the forest socioeconomic sustainable development. As this initiative scale, ensuring they stay on the right path becomes critical. Clear guidance on how to support the organizations behind them is essential. So sharing actionable real-world insight for businesses is essential to accelerate implementation, moving really from great intentions to amazing impact. This is where the contribution of the Institute for Human Rights and Business is particularly valuable. The Institute provides concrete examples of business models and decision pathways that have successfully achieved commercial, climate, and social outcomes. This valuable work offers guidance on where industry actors should focus their efforts over the next 5 years, including workforce transition, supply chain resilience, responsible closure, and diversification strategies. With a clear mandate, Climate Champions team, in partnership with COP presidencies and UNFCCC, is eager to align efforts around the following core priorities for this year, 2026. Strengthening the action agenda and putting the 5-year plan from 2006 to 2030 into practice. To institutionalize this mutirão spirit that we started in Belém, so that the practical framework established there becomes the source for global implementation. We need to support the implementation of the 120 plans to accelerate solutions already published at COP30. These plans, they address key levers such as market supply and demand, technologies, policy, and finance, and they are widely recognized as effective tools for advancing collective transformative action. And we need to increase the number of plans to make sure that we cover additional technologies and additional solutions. I know many of you are already prioritizing their implementation in 2026. Additionally, the action agenda will focus on inclusive implementation and broaden engagement with the relevant stakeholders needed to deliver results. And finally, we must maintain momentum and deliver results leading up to COP31 in Turkey, supported by our friends in Australia and the Pacific Islands. The task is immense, but as well as the opportunities that could be achieved through accelerated sustainable socioeconomic development around the world. So thank you once again for your leadership and active engagement throughout this process, and I look forward to this new cycle of climate action with lots of implementation.
Thank you, Dan. You mentioned COP31 happening later this year in Turkey. So I'm curious, can you share any early insights into what we should expect and how best to engage at COP31, sorry?
Well, I'll give you a personal insight because this is all very new. My colleague Samed was announced last week, the climate champion for COP31. We have now the presidency already established for COP31, and we know Australia and the islands are working along with Turkey to define their priorities. So there is a lot of content already, but we must recognize that they are in the initial stage of getting organized and getting those thoughts together. But seems that we are going to have, I believe, a stronger cycle than COP30, honestly, in terms of moving forward with the implementation of the action agenda. Maybe for two reasons which are easy to understand. The first one, we started this work around April, May, so last year. And really, we started to run the activation groups and hence the plans to accelerate solutions from the end of July. So now there is this framework which was established there, which is flexible enough to bring different objectives, different priorities, but is ready to run. We call this sort of engine of implementation, and it's true. Along with all of you, with all the community, with this 482, if I'm not wrong, initiatives in the 30 activation groups, we can play around with that. Eventually, we don't need 30 activation groups, more or less. We will be defining this with the Turkey leadership, but there is a very good structure in place. So as we work from day one of the year and we didn't stop, of course, we see better, in my opinion, better, more intense, more relevant results in the COP31 cycle. And by the way, we already have leadership for COP32. So it's a great opportunity to have a longer cycle using a methodology flexible, allowing for all the changes that need to come every year, but that allow you guys, the ecosystem, to work intensively. I used to say, sort of as a motivation thing, that we should work 365 days, 24 hours per day, given the relevance of what we're doing. But in essence, that's what's coming up. We started this end of July, and now we have a full year to work with a very good methodology with all the aligned partners. So I'm fairly optimistic, regardless of geopolitical subjects, because they're not going to go away, and we need to go through them. But if we have a very productive, efficient way to work, given the economic realities, I think we will see results as we are seeing, for example, in the energy sector that I mentioned, the 1 trillion and much more to come.
Thank you so much, Dan, for joining us, and best wishes for your next engagement. Thank you for sharing those insights into what's coming up and what to expect in Turkey. Look forward to seeing you there as well. So I'm going to let Dan go and hand over to my dear colleague, Haley St. Dennis, who leads IHRB's work on just transitions, including the Just Stories project that is launching the report that I mentioned earlier, which is coming out today. So Haley, over to you.
Thanks so much, Brandee. And thank you, Dan, if you can still hear me. That was an incredibly helpful sort of whistle-stop tour, through unpacking a multilateral process that I think can feel disconnected sometimes from the real economy and the business actors who are, in fact, one of the primary delivery vehicles for industrial transition. As Brandee said, we are launching a new report today at IHRB, and I just want to say 2 quick words about it, which is, please read it, share your feedback with us. The lessons we've gathered are intended to be helpful to you, to really offer concrete insights for corporate practitioners on the how, because there is a lot of talk about the principles of just transitions, the need for clearer definitions often, but we know the climate emergency won't wait for these, and nor will the workers and communities hit harder every day by an ever-changing climate and their own economic conditions. And there are examples out there. Just transitions is not mere theory. And so this report really gathers insights across 4 real-time cases that we at IHRB have dove very deeply into, where the disruptive nature of the transition is being harnessed as a catalyst for growth, for innovation, and long-term competitiveness. So I will stop there because I hope the report really speaks for itself, and you'll shortly also be receiving a copy to your inboxes. What I'm extremely excited to do next is bring in some industry practitioners to share from their perspective how any of this really can work in practice, what that looks like, what's hard, what are the benefits, and what's on the horizon in the run-up to 2030. Joining me today, you can see on screen, are practitioners representing a number of different sectors. We have Yann Wyss from Nestlé, Dr. Daisy Hessenberger from Arcadis, and James Magor from Actis. I'll shortly also introduce a 4th speaker, Amol Mehra from the Laudes Foundation, to come in as a bit of a respondent, offering some reflections from the philanthropic perspective. But let's jump right in. I want to start first really with a simple question, but one that requires each of you to really boil this down for us, which is, what is the most important lesson from your experiences so far on just transitions? And knowing there's often a tension to navigate between speed and scale on the one hand and stakeholder needs on the other, a lesson, if you can, that really became clear once you had to make a real decision trade-off. And let me start with you, Daisy, if I can. You direct industry activation at Arcadis and are the subject matter expert on nature-based solutions. This is for a leading global consulting and engineering firm specializing in natural and built assets. Is there a sort of single critical lesson that comes to you that really kind of illustrates a moment of, decision-making under constraint?
Yes, I mean, we have a lot of lessons that we take on board, and thank you for the kind introduction. But I'm going to focus on one because it's the one that we're also using to really drive forward our strategy on this. And just to put it in context, so yeah, we're a global design and engineering consultancy, but we're ultimately 36,000 people, delivering about tens of thousands of projects a year across a lot of different industries. So as a transformational force, just our staff, we see a huge amount of impact possible. And our purpose is quite simply to improve the quality of life. That's the sentence we give you. And how do we do this? We do that by making sustainable project choices, by creating sustainable livable places, infrastructure where people and communities can thrive. This is all baked into our website. You can read it anytime. But hopefully you can see the just transition is sort of baked into our purpose and what we're seeking to deliver. So what that looks like in practice is, well, I've already mentioned, we work across industries, geographies, and value chains. And in all of those, we work on some level of the energy transition. We're helping our clients shift from low carbon to renewable energy sources. Those are the projects we love, whether it's an industrial manufacturer updating a site, or we're restoring some brownfield site for a municipality. That's probably the work we're most excited about in the energy transition. And again, I hope you can see, again, taking a people-first approach, which is also one of our core values, is really integral to that kind of work. However, it hasn't always been easy, and we've had to learn a lot along the way. And in the industries that we work in, especially for the built environment, there are always trade-offs, like you mentioned, and they're complex. What we have learned is that those trade-offs are not always what they seem, though. And so our main lesson I'm going to take forward today, and which we're acting upon internally, is we need to account for impact. So we've really learned the importance of true accounting. Now, we're part of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the CEO there, Peter Backer, he loves to quote, "Accountants will save the world." I'm not sure that's quite as simple as it is, but what we've seen at a real level in Arcadis is that if we account for the value of, I don't know, let's say some of our co-design processes in the Netherlands when we're doing urban planning, or if we take more a gendered approach to a certain mobility scheme, if we account for the right things, we can really show how in many cases investing in the just transition is not the trade-off it seems to be. It's not as simple as like, oh, this will cost me more money and time. It's a cost to the project. And specifically in the way that we work in our projects and project cycles, slower at the start can mean quicker at the end. So permitting bottlenecks, I'm sure everybody in the energy transition knows what a challenge they are. We see stakeholder engagement as a market, because for us, it's a mechanism to really make sure our clients have a social and environmental license to operate it. So we sell that as a service. It's directly tied to smoother and faster permitting. And we know when those community issues are addressed upstream and social risks minimized, we know our clients face fewer objections with regulatory agencies, fewer late-stage revisions on projects, fewer public hearings with community pushback. So it's really a business case for us. There's one example that's always quoted, which is this $2.4 billion energy project. Community conflicts added $750 million US. That's about 31% extra costs. And all of that could have basically been avoidable. So yes, there are trade-offs, but if we account for them in the right way, we actually don't see this as a cost. And so how we're actioning that is we believe that what gets measured gets managed and then improved. So to continue to support the just transition work we do, we are actively scaling up impact measurement in our organization, trying to bring social impact measurement as well as nature and circularity and water, carbon. But we're going to bring that to projects that maybe wouldn't necessarily have accounted for that in the past.
Thank you, Daisy. That's incredibly rich. Lots of good nuggets in there. I really did like that the sort of trade-offs are not always what they seem. And also, slower at the start can mean quicker at the end, both, I think, quite concrete. And I'll come back on the measurement question. But I want to come to you next, James, Sustainability Principal at Actis, a UK headquartered but global infrastructure investor. So wind and solar, as you can see on the screen, really being your kind of bread and butter. In your experience, what is that kind of one lesson that you can distill for listeners that might have come from navigating a potentially difficult trade-off, for example, on risk, returns, timing, or governance? What would you bring up?
Great, thanks, Hayley, and thanks for inviting me to join you today. Apologies, but I'm going to cheat and have two lessons, if I may. Look, as a private capital investor, the first and most important and in some ways most encouraging lesson is that we haven't seen a trade-off between community investment and financial performance. I mean, quite the opposite. We see investing in development, investing in stakeholder relations as really important for risk management. And ultimately, businesses that demonstrate strong stakeholder relations typically benefit from more competitive exits, leading to higher valuations. The second lesson we've learned is that implementing just transitions it's most effective when it's deliberate, proactive, and strategic. So whenever Actis invests in a company, we establish a board sustainability committee, and we set clear expectations that the business must develop a stakeholder engagement strategy that includes a plan to support community development and share the benefits. So this is a clear, what I call a top-down direction from the stakeholder and from the board. And this is then complemented by the local management team, providing us with bottom-up analysis about what are the most effective development opportunities at a project location. So being proactive and strategic, what that really means is that when we develop a wind or solar project, we don't simply impose local workforce quotas on contractors. We work with the community throughout the project development phase to provide skills training, secure identity documents, open bank accounts, get waste management licenses, obtain food hygiene certificates. Basically, we try to anticipate and then remove all the potential obstacles to local recruitment and procurement of local services, so that once our wind or solar project moves to construction and then into operations, we're confident that the benefits of the project and the energy transition more broadly can therefore be shared with the host community.
Thank you, James. That's really concrete and answers, I think, a common question or struggle, which is really how do you, within a large, often quite distributed company, take both a sort of high level and strategic approach, but also match that with that bottom up, very localized, place-based reality. I want to unpack that further, but let me now bring in Yann Wyss, Global Head of Social Impact and Human Rights at Nestlé, one of the world's largest food companies, of course. From your experience, Yann, what is that single lesson that really might have come from a hard trade-off around possibly, cost or speed, but also control, perhaps?
Thanks, Haley, and thank you for having me. For us, Just Transition is all about helping farmers and farming communities adapt to climate change and transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture. And I wanted to say this from the outset because I want to expand a bit the scope of this conversation to the energy transition, to what I think is a transition like overall, right? Of course, the energy component is super important, but I think what is for us as the largest food and beverage company in the world, really the bulk of the emissions are really like in our upstream supply chain, so in agriculture, and not that much like in operations or distribution activities. And so for us actually to get to net zero, that means that, we have to transition to regenerative agriculture. This is the only way. And I think that makes this conversation interesting from that perspective, because we don't actually get to hear a lot from non-energy companies or non-infrastructure companies and what that means. And this is what I want to offer here today. So we work with like 5 to 6 million farmers overall, like sourcing cocoa, coffee, palm oil, cereals, corn, you name it. And we work directly with around 500,000 of them. So these are really like farmers that, we have a direct contact with, and that we are really like equipping to actually adapt to climate change through high yielding plantlets, through new agricultural practices, through new ways of like analyzing soil health, through compost activities. So very practical, tangible activities, because farmers will only like implement what they believe in, right? They are really like, you need to convince them that it works. It's not enough actually to tell them what they should do. If they don't see it working, they will not do it, because they are, of course, like very dependent on what they produce. And so this is really like, I think the one of the challenges that we are facing as a company. This is really like to convince farmers that like they need to change the way that they have been doing agriculture for a very long time. But more than convincing them, is really like to show them that it works. So really like working on demonstration farms where we actually like test new techniques like pruning or agricultural practices, and really like give them a chance to actually see it by themselves that it works, so they can then implement that in their own activities. So for us, it's not related that much related to operations or tier one suppliers or distribution. This is really like our capacity to engage in a meaningful and constructive way with the farmers that we depend on to make our products. So that's why we focus so much on Regen Ag, and we made commitment to 2025, 2030 to actually source half of all our raw material ingredients through Regen Ag areas.
Thank you, Yann. I think that makes the imperative so clear, both from a sort of planetary and human perspective. We know smallholders in particular provide about 1/3 of the world's food. Their resilience and really their ability to thrive affects us all. But also what was very clear for me is how much of a commercial imperative it is for you and other food and beverage producers to really meet farmers and producers where they're at. As you said, if they don't believe in it, they won't implement it. So I wanted to kind of draw on that lesson and follow up with you, Yann, to really now kind of ground the conversation in concrete examples, if we can. And if you can really kind of share an example, particularly around how you've strengthened, credibility and stakeholder trust by partnering directly with farmers or with suppliers. Is there, a very concrete example you can give us of how that actually impacted sort of a decision design or a sequencing design?
Yes, I have like a few examples, but I will concentrate on two. But my message here is that what really like interests me in this discussion is like how we can really merge or at least align our climate zero net interventions with human rights. And this is really, in my view, really quite key because, of course, you can unpack the human rights agenda, and our focus as part of this just transition discussion is really like on living income. And the reason why it's important is because we want to make sure that as we actually, encourage farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture, we want to make sure that they can actually make a living out of this transition, right? I mean, if they actually lose money, first of all, they will not implement these practices, but also, we will not be able to buy the raw materials that we need from them. So living income has become quite a key metric for us to actually see whether this transition works, not only from a GHG reduction or regen ag transition perspective, but also like from a farmer perspective. So are they making more money out of this transition? Are they losing money? Is it like equal? So this is something that we are measuring across the board. And so I really wanted to use two specific examples here. This is coffee in Indonesia, where we are quite an extensive regenerative agriculture program in Indonesia. And we are using cash incentives to incentivize farmers to change behaviors or practices. So we actually reward farmers in addition to, of course, the price we pay for the raw material, but also in addition to premiums for certification. We actually have a cash incentive scheme to really incentivize farmers to test new ways of farming their land to actually grow coffee trees and harvest coffee. And this is really working. So, we just last year we released a study with TechnoServe and other coffee companies that shows that the increase of income is like 62% for farmers. So of course, I mean, it will of course vary from a country to another, from a region to another. So I really don't want to make like an overstatement in terms of like showing that it shows everywhere, but the potential is there. So the potential for income improvement is 62%. The potential for decrease in coffee emissions is 38%. So of course, this needs to be well done, and this needs to be measured. To Daisy points earlier, I mean, we need to be able to measure this proof, new activities. Another example is in Côte d'Ivoire. That is something that I like talking because this is one of the most advanced programs that we have, but also here using cash incentives to reward farmers for pruning their trees. And that becomes super interesting. And sorry if it's a bit technical, but like in a transition to conventional to regenerative agriculture, where you will like incentivize farmers not to use pesticides or herbicides, their capacity to prune trees and really like look after the trees is becoming super essential, because that's a way to protect their trees and their harvests from diseases. But it's not very natural actually for cocoa farmers to prune their trees, because the belief is that the smaller the tree, the less productive it will be. So again, here we are setting up demonstration farms to actually show them that even if you cut significant branches of your tree, it will become more productive, that will protect it actually from diseases. It's a long-term game, right? Because it's impossible to show them from one day to the other that this is working. So we need actually to really have this long-term engagement with the farmers and really like get on this journey with them, making sure that they understand what is expected from them in terms of like, for example, pruning, but also making sure that as they do this, their level of productivity doesn't increase and their level of income actually like does increase. So this is like all the measuring and evaluation system that we are putting together with a number of partners that we are testing. So just two examples. I'm not saying that, we have the solution and the solution will work everywhere, but we are testing different approaches according to different raw material ingredients and geographies and see what works best.
Thank you, Yann. That's, I think the more specific the example, often the more illustrative and insightful in terms of the lessons that can be taken. And it just shows how central the agency of farmers is, that it's not a one-off consultation exercise. It is daily core to business. Thank you. I'll come back, but I want to bring in James now on the example side from that investor perspective. And I think, you know, at times that can feel more distant, how you really involve those most affected in a more day-to-day agency-centered perspective in design and implementation. So would love to hear an example from how Actis approaches that.
Yeah, thanks, Hayley. I'm going to talk about a wind farm we developed in Kenya called Kipeto. And for those that are interested, the Nature Conservancy produced a wonderful case study about Kipeto, really showcasing how renewable energy communities and wildlife can coexist. The wind farm was developed along a ridge of the Great Rift Valley, and that's used by vultures for foraging and the Maasai for cattle grazing. And through the project, we worked with the local conservation agencies to develop a comprehensive avifauna protection plan, which also created jobs. It helped to protect Maasai cattle from predators and secured the social license to operate from the local community. From a governance perspective, we created a board subcommittee that was focused on biodiversity and conservation. We invited the national and some international conservation NGOs to come and sit on that committee. We set up a community trust to invest in local social development. And we also secured quite an innovative mezzanine facility that became known as the Vulture Fund, with the proceeds from that used for regional conservation work. Now, all of this work helped to secure senior debt to build the project. It de-risked project delivery, and it ultimately enhanced the equity returns when we exited the project in 2023. So, I mean, the lesson from this and the key message to take away is at Actis, we don't go searching for conservation problems to solve. You know, that's not our job. We're there to build reliable, renewable energy projects. But it was that human-wildlife conflict in that particular area that to some extent dictated our strategy and helped to deliver a really terrific outcome. It was a true win-win for everyone involved in the project, and it was a personal career highlight. Yeah.
That's so interesting, James, and just another example of, you know, I think had you taken a relatively standard top-down approach, that could have easily been missed and resulted in a very different, you know, early relationship, and instead turned into an absolute asset for the project and for the communities. Thank you. Daisy, would love to hear your kind of example on the sort of natural or built side where that sort of worker or, you know, community agency and input really shaped a design or sequencing decision.
Absolutely. And I'm also going to speak about my two favorite ones. But actually what Yann was saying on farmers was making me smile because, you know, 36,000 people in our staff, a lot of civil engineers, and they are a unique species of human as well. In terms of, like farmers, they really need evidence, very concrete evidence that something will work before they let, you know, a village drive over a new bridge. So we have faced some of the similar kind of transformative change challenges there. The examples I'm going to speak to, again, great point from Yann, not just the energy transition, but on climate adaptation is where we see a lot of the just transition work coming in. And some of our best examples can be seen in our cities work, which I'm personally very passionate about. So we work across a lot of different systems in cities. We do water infrastructure and sewage, mobility plans, transport, real estate, and even financial advisory. So there's a lot of complex stakeholder networks and a lot of limitations, especially in our original home, the Netherlands, very limited for space. But the example I want to talk about is our work with Birmingham on their climate strategy, really. So it's a bit closer to home for me in the UK. And Birmingham, if you don't know, industrial giant of the region it's in for the UK. And as industry changed, it also needed to change. Most recently, this has looked like its approach to climate change. And as part of their strategy, they wanted to become a city of nature. They wanted to scale up green infrastructure. They were like, yep, we've got the business case on nature recovery for the city, sold. And part of that process that was really illuminating was the setting up of the Birmingham Climate Change Adaptation Partnership with a lot of different players. And what came out of that is they wanted to make sure that this really served the people, that the social component was really core to this climate change approach. And so with them, there was a risk mapping tool where the ecosystem services were mapped against a deprivation index, basically. And it created an environmental justice map. Now, a lot of you are probably familiar with that, right? You're like, yeah, you map, where the most deprived areas are and, who are the people that really need maybe more green space for our urban heat island effect. But what I really liked about this piece of work was that kind of partnership and approach and emphasis on social led to the development of neighborhood adaptation action plans. And these were prepared with local people and businesses and really included practical recommendations. Where are we going to put this? We need hundreds of trees in this area and we think it should all go here. But where do you guys actually need trees? Where are you waiting with your children, for the school bus? Those are the things that maybe we wouldn't know. So taking that neighborhood approach really allowed them to address, yes, the nature, but the social component at the same time. And cities around the world face the same thing. We know that the solutions that we need for success, they consider this social component. And Haley, because you've interrupted me, I assume that we're running short on time, so I can skip my next example.
No, please. I was just going to come in and say what a great illustration that was of how really dignity in design plays out in those small places in our neighborhoods, as you say, where people are waiting, for the bus or with their children. Such a really inspiring example of how that can be operationalized. But please bring in your next example. I think we're okay for time.
Okay, great. You hit the nail on the head there, because very good civil engineering metaphor. It's the same in the next example. So in Australia, it's particularly obvious to us the value of engagement and working with communities, specifically Indigenous peoples. So in Australia, they have reconciliation action plans, which we started in 2018. And these reconciliation action plans, they're basically a framework for an organization to leverage their influence, their structure, what they do, to support the national reconciliation movement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So we're a part of a network of 2,700 corporate, government, not-for-profit organizations that have these action plans. It's a wonderful document, but what does that actually mean on the ground? Well, it changes how our people work, and ultimately then changes project design. So for example, there's the Metronet Western Australia project, Nicholson Road Station, which we're designing and planning. And an Aboriginal engagement panel was created. Local elders, they were consulted on masters of cultural and design solutions. And it influenced the project in a lot of different ways. But the most significant is they were able to then identify, saying that there was a significant watering hole, which previously was not known of. If we had not identified that, there is a good chance that created greater cost for the client later in the project. But because we were able to identify it, Arcadis engineers were able to plan to protect that site, maintain it. Very specifically, we were looking at stormwater management around climate adaptation. And so we changed the stormwater design. We made it so that waters were diverted. We didn't want to pollute this very important cultural site. Or if water did go towards that site, it had to go through pollutant treatment prior to being discharged there. So again, an example of what you said, Haley, these very small areas of influence that can have big impacts on communities. And I'd like to close with, we could come up with so many more great examples. Many of them are in story form. Like Yann also mentioned, we're lacking those kind of hard metrics. I say it might have cost us more later, but I can't tell you how much it would have cost us more later if we hadn't had that panel. And so we often talk about these lighthouse projects, and I'm really excited about Just Stories because we'd like to see these kind of stories happen on every single project. For 36,000 Arcadians to have, every one of them should have a story of a project, from the very small and the banal, like designing a bus stop, up to an urban city plan. Yeah.
Thank you, Daisy. That's really helpful, insightful, and appreciated on the Just Stories side. Agree. The more examples we can capture, particularly of the people, the perspectives, and the relationships behind these industrial transitions, from the small individual project all the way through to the kind of cumulative and how it fits together within a large corporate such as Arcadis. I want to bring in Amol now, Amol Mehra, to respond really to what you've heard so far from the perspective of philanthropy, often the critical player coming into many transition scenarios first, finding ways often to de-risk some of the social components that can otherwise hold up early stage investments and really enables the private sector to crowd in and bring scale. So curious, Amol, what's struck you so far from the lessons and examples you've heard?
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Haley, and thank you for the work of IHRB. I think the report that you're releasing today is really critical reading at an important time on how we can add sort of structure, clarity into how these transitions are playing out. I also think the speakers did a really good job of highlighting that across sectors, and I echo Yann's call to think beyond the transition and a just transition from a purely from a more expansive industry lens. We can use these frameworks and approaches to talk about a number of the transitions that we need to see, not just those involving energy and utilities, as Yann said. So I think a couple things really stood out to me from the conversation and the discussion thus far. One was this sort of idea about governance and strategy, the areas that can be inhibitors or accelerators. And I think it's interesting to hear about the ways that just transition language is increasingly embedded in these climate strategies, in board oversight, and in risk management, not just treated as a CSR add-on, but integrated into the business value. I think each of the stories that we heard today from these companies are telling us that that's what's happening. I also love the examples around workforce and livelihood focused action. I think Yann expanded us beyond thinking about workers alone, but thinking about farmers and the livelihood of farmers, and Nestlé's commitment to look at living wage really brings another lens into how just transition can ameliorate more than just the sort of workforce alone types of issues. And then I think each of the speakers did a good job of nailing the community engagement and supply chain engagement piece, that the transition won't be won or lost in boardrooms. It is exactly in the engagement with communities and companies that the transition and the durability of it will be proven. So Haley, to your work at IHRB and the leadership that you've had over the number of years, we've been working with you on the just transition stories. I think it really does capture all of these aspects: early planning, worker and community engagement, and place-based approaches, moving beyond abstract commitments and into action. That's something we in philanthropy love to see, and we really view ourselves as instigators of that through our philanthropic resources and the convenings we make with our partners. And I think philanthropy has a unique role to play here. I'll name a couple ways that I think we step in. And for background, Laudes Foundation is focused on accelerating just transitions of industries. While we focus on the built environment, on fashion, on food systems, and finance and capital markets, we also have a new cross-industry approach, looking at those meta levers that exist. And we're really seeing those kind of pertaining to a number of areas. One is on innovation. Philanthropic capital can support early piloting, things like worker reskilling and skills maps. Also, community-led transition planning. What works and why? And how can we test that out so that we can scale the types of solutions that are finding purchase? Also on supplier engagement. Most of the topics happen at the brand level when most of the change that needs to happen is much deeper in the supply chain. We're doing a lot of interesting work with our partners much deeper in the supply chain on suppliers. So that's one, innovation. The second is on worker and community voice. We know that civil societies are an increasingly fragile place. Funding cuts and restrictions are happening in many markets. So how do we strengthen workers to be at the table, their inclusion agency, and the accountability ultimately to them for the transition? There's a role for philanthropy there. The third is the evidence base. And Haley, this is your work at IHRB for us. You're telling the stories that are capturing best practice. Even this panel is a perfect example of that. How can we continue to build the evidence base that makes just transition not an abstract concept, but a lived reality? And finally, the role of convening. Philanthropy can help support as a neutral broker, bringing together the multi-stakeholder coalitions that will lead to change. So I'll leave it there, but I really appreciate the dialogue today, especially in a moment where we've seen policy opportunities opening up through the Berlin Action Mechanism and others, and now seeing some robust examples of how companies are living this in practice. Thanks.
Thanks, Amol. And can I follow up actually just to take a bit of a step back and just get your sense of where you're still seeing kind of private capital structurally unable to move fast or deep enough?
And I'd love to say that I'm not seeing that. I think we find the biggest challenge on this in this whole area is the allocation of capital towards these opportunities. Much of the change that happens is in the emerging markets or in markets where there's not necessarily the same ROI yet on and proven ability to make returns. So there is, I think, let's say, there needs to be work done there to sort of support the development of these opportunities into financially viable investment paths. We're supporting a lot of good work there, including with groups like the Asia Investor Group on climate change and others. But I think there's a lot more that can be done to unlock this financing. But this business case and the returns that you're capturing in your stories help show that there's a way.
Thanks, Amol. And I think that segues us really nicely kind of to the challenge side. So I want to come in for one more round on that, because so much of this really requires learning by doing and kind of feeling your way in the dark to overcome a mix of new but also old barriers. And so thinking about kind of where we are today and where we need to be by 2030, this sort of very critical interim milestone, I just want to round out with where you each are seeing just transition commitments come under pressure from politics or cost or time. And from your perspective, really, what helps prevent backsliding? Daisy, can I come to you first on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll speak maybe to our specific context rather than a more global one, because as a consultancy, yes, a design and engineering consultancy, but we really are pretty beholden to what our clients want and therefore what the markets are doing, what our industries are delivering on. And so, yeah, we have noticed some of that changing. We've noticed some things slowing down, some certain choices being made on projects. Projects that we expected to go ahead may be delayed. But we've also seen that the direction of travel in our industry, which is, basically delivering pretty hard value to people and our clients, hasn't really changed. If you still want to address urban heat, you might not just have the word climate change or sustainability to it, but the urban heat or, something damaging your assets because of soil erosion, you still got to deal with that. So we've definitely seen the direction of travel continue, and that's not just in our clients and markets, but it's also very specific to us. So that's the main thing that I wanted to say about how we've prevented, or we haven't seen backsliding as Arcadis. I think it's two things, but one is probably more important than the other, which is a values-based approach. So Arcadis, the identity, our people-first approach, our purpose, our core values in Arcadis exist regardless of the politics, the cost trade-offs, the time. And I think that's really what keeps such a large corporate steady. They let us keep sustainability and therefore the just transition really at the core of our strategy. Maybe not as fast or as we want, but still in the right direction. And then the second part that's helped us with backsliding, I'd say, is really adapting to our clients' expectations. So yes, some of our clients have changed. Some projects are going ahead that we didn't think would go ahead in this time and age. But adapting to that helps us help our clients and therefore industries kind of go ahead in the transition, not just the energy transition, but addressing climate adaptation, the nature positive transition. And what's a good example of that? So whatever the politics of sustainability and ESG is doing, like I said, decreasing urban heat to protect infrastructure, your staff, so that you don't have less downtime. You don't want downtime on any kind of asset. That's always wanted. Whether you're doing that through a nature-based solution or something that we know is really radical on climate adaptation or pretty gray infrastructure, as long as it works, that's what the client wants. So now we change our language a bit. We talk about physical risk and we scale up measurement into impact data, right? Because we can tell a more meaningful story. We look at test cases. We use different case studies. So adapting has also helped us deliver still what our clients want without that kind of backsliding. And that's really the two things on backsliding. We do internally really focus on our workforce, those 36,000 people. We want to prepare them for the future. We used to work on certain parts of oil and gas. We don't work on that to the same scale or in the same projects. So how do we prepare our workforce for the future? And how do we prepare also all the different energy professionals we'll need, by 2050 to deliver this. So we invest quite heavily in internal workforce enablement projects and also with, STEM programs outside of Arcadis. That's part of the just transition for us, is, what are ecologists going to do when AI is used more in nature measurement, for example? We want to make sure that they're doing better, more valuable work because of that, not losing something. But it all comes down to showing measurable value for us. That builds that trust to innovate.
Thanks, Stacey. I wrote that down, sort of data equals more meaningful storytelling. And I think that ties also really nicely to what you said around values keeping a corporate steady. I'll remember both of those. James and Yann, both of you really, same question on backsliding, or maybe put another way, really, what's one well-intentioned kind of just transition approach you've seen not work and why?
Yeah. Haley, maybe if I can come in on that. Look, you always have to consider the unintended consequences of just transition initiatives. To give you a real world example, South Africa has an amazing renewable energy program. It's moving the country away from a coal-based energy system to utilize the abundant wind and solar resources. And Actis has successfully invested in multiple rounds of the program, and we can speak to its many successes. But one of the conditions of the renewable energy program is that companies must invest around 2% of project revenue in socioeconomic development within a 50-kilometer radius of the project site. And this is a really significant amount of money. Failure to make quarterly grants results in regulatory penalties that can lead to PPA termination. This socioeconomic development investment component, it was and it is a great idea. However, we observed that due to the quarterly compliance requirements and the threat of penalties, most of the IPPs were quite understandably focused on getting money out of the door, rather than working to identify long-term transformational initiatives that could really catalyze South Africa's just transition. To try and help correct this, Actis, along with two of our energy companies that were operating in South Africa, we created a not-for-profit learning center called the Initiative for Social Performance in Renewable Energy, more catchily known as INSPIRE. That provides guidance and training to IPPs about the most effective deployment of SED funds in order to maximize social development benefits. And that center is training lots of the country's IPPs to try and really catalyze South Africa's just transition.
That's such an interesting example, James, of, as you say, the unintended consequences, and just really reinforces the point of continuous learning and adjustment on this. Most transitions are going to unfold over the next 1 to 2 decades, and that doesn't mean what is set now will be the perfect answer for what comes in 5 years. Yann, on either backsliding or unintended consequences, curious what that stokes for you.
Yeah, and I'll be quick because I just want to support what Daisy said about the political risk. I mean, for us, it's not that we are ignoring it, but for us, it's core to our business, right? It's about how we're going to source our ingredients in the future, how we can professionalize farmers, help them adapt to climate. So this noise around climate just transition is not really affecting our operations. Of course, we participate in these discussions, but it's really built into what we want to do in the future. But also agreeing with James' comment on unintended consequences. And for us, that means not leaving farmers behind, right? Because very small scale farmers, the questions we have is that will they be able to actually transition, and what does it mean? What does it require from us in terms of support, but also from other stakeholders like government, investors, to help farmers transition? This is really my biggest worry, that we actually leave alone a category of farmers that cannot actually make this transition. And so this is something that we are monitoring very closely and keeping an eye on, but clearly it does require collective solutions. We cannot be the only one actually trying to make it work.
Thank you, Yann. And we are okay for time. We were a little selfish in the scheduling of this and took 75 instead of a tight 60. But let me bring you in, Amol, to kind of round this out. Again, on looking ahead, I guess, to the next 4 really critical years, what does the field really need more of, and what does it need less of at this point in time?
Yeah, I think for us at Laudes, a lot of our investments are focused on sort of the pathways and the toolkits that are necessary to move from intention to action. So we've been supporting work at the Equitable Transition Initiative of the World Economic Forum to provide more clarity on how businesses can engage in this transition across their value chains. At the same time, we're supporting work at the OECD to look at where we can tuck in some of these standards, processes, and just transition approaches there. So I think part of it is demystifying what we mean by just transition in actual business practice. I think the other thing is doing what we're doing here, which is lifting leaders and creating space for others and encouragement for the willing to follow. And I think we need to keep amplifying opportunities and stories of the progress that's here, because I think it's so easy to get distracted by the noise. And I think that's where we lose. The momentum is here, as Yann has mentioned, and as all of these speakers are detailing, part of their business is to succeed in this regard. And so I think harnessing that, telling those stories is really critical to keep the momentum going.
Thanks, Amol. And I think that's really one of the underlying, core through threads that came across every single just story that we at IHRB have spotlit over the last couple of years. Sorry, I just got a bit of an echo. I think it's gone now. Sorry, was that through thread around really just transitions as kind of a strategic advantage for companies and those within the ecosystem that take these approaches, really building entirely new value propositions that are ahead of the game and ahead of the curve. I'm conscious of time. I think we have a few questions from the audience, several in fact, so I might just quickly cherry pick and really draw on a couple of the inputs. We'll never be able to sort of do all of them justice. One for you, Yann, which is really around how you collect reliable and transparent data at the bottom of the value chain to really measure kind of the success that you've described, and just considering, you know, that many degrees of separation between headquarters and sort of the farm.
Yes, thank you for the question, and I'll share a few links in the chat if that's okay. But basically, we are working with different monitoring and evaluation partners, because I mean this monitoring part is so important, right? To make sure that we are going in the right direction, that we avoid generating unintended consequences. So when I say we are monitoring that closely. This is very closely. And so I will invite you, if you are interested in really having a look at the KIT Institute reports that we work with on cocoa. It's a mix of analysis, desktop analysis, but most importantly, interviews with farmers and farming communities in both Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana to really not only measure quantitatively the impact that we have, but also get their feedback on, how it works from their perspective. And so really, I can invite you to have a look at their latest report. It's on their website. I'll share the link with you. And another example I want to mention here is TechnoServe. I've already mentioned the study that we did with them and 3 other coffee companies, really trying to see what is the impact of regen ag on farmers' living incomes. And so they actually came up with what I think are really encouraging projections, because for us, I mean, one thing that we didn't know when we embarked on this transition was the impact on farmers' incomes. And it's quite reassuring that, to see that it can work. Again, I'm not saying that, it will work everywhere. We need to be careful. And sometimes it does require some subsidizing from us, from governments. But, in most of the cases, we can make it work. And so it's all about coming up with the innovation that is required to actually make it work for us from a business perspective and also from communities. So I'll share these 2 links. I think these are quite, they contain very interesting insights, at least from our perspective on specific supply chains, coffee and cocoa.
Thank you, Yann. And a question for you, James, really getting right at the heart of, investor leverage, which is, do you adjust sort of Actis financial support, fees and costs, depending on a project's commitment to sustainability and those associated principles?
Yeah, I think that was from Helen Russell, if that's right. Hi, Helen. I'm not sure I completely understand the question, but let me have a go. I think when we think about our investment strategy, we're certainly not looking at anything like adjusted returns or concessional returns in order to achieve sustainability objectives or social development objectives for that matter. Actis doesn't invest in North America or in the US. We don't invest in Western Europe, but we do invest across Asia, Africa, Middle East, Latin America, where 85% of the world's population live. Some people call it the rest of the world. It's actually most of the world, right? So, but yet only a third of the world's capital is chasing opportunities there. So we don't invest in those markets for a political reason. It's not led by a particular mandate. It's not led by an obligation to invest in emerging or developing markets. It's just a really compelling investment opportunity. And our investors expect really compelling returns as well for that. So there's no sense of adjusting fees, costs, returns for sustainability. It's part of how we generate that alpha and how we generate those returns.
I think that's really interesting, James. And Daisy, another question really getting at the kind of heart of financial feasibility for you, which is, any exemplary cases where you kind of struck that balance between a profitability profile of a project versus and because of the requests of the impacted community.
Yeah, I'm really glad for this question, because the answer that I have an exemplary case study of this, because we generally talk about the lighthouse projects, right? If a client comes to us and says, hey, co-design project on this, wonderful, yeah, we will do brilliant stakeholder engagement with them. We will look at the just transition angle on it. But the reality is a lot of projects don't necessarily strike the best balance between financial feasibility and profitability. I'm sure there are examples where I can tell you a beautiful story about where profitability was increased because we took X, Y, Z. And I guess one of the things that we talk about is also where that balance feels a bit off. How do we make sure that we still do best by those clients, by those people? And for us, it goes back again to a values-driven approach. We have a really strong health and safety policy, culture, value in Arcadis. And so, people are really encouraged to flag issues and celebrate it if they find health and safety or values challenges. And so that's some way that we really try and address the fact that not in every project, there's not necessarily a beautiful balance. And something that, again, we love from the Just Stories, but we also want to see more of, is learning from the reality of the situation, learning, well, when we can't perfectly balance than that, how can we do better, if not perfect? How can we be as close to just as possible in each project?
Thanks, Daisy, for ending on that note.
If this panel happens in a year's time, I will come with this example. And you're welcome to reach out in the meantime.
I think
hopefully
that's the
plenty
point,
of examples.
That's the point. I think it's a quest. And in fact, imperfect is often going to be what's at hand. And it's about how you constantly navigate those tensions through values, through measurement, through governance, and also through the agency of those most affected. So I think that rounds things out perfectly. We are essentially at time, but I want to end with the same question for each of you that we ask everyone we interview at Just Stories, which is, if you had to describe what a just transition means to you in one word, what would that be? And let me go in reverse order. So I'm going to pick on you first, Amol. One word.
Dignity.
James?
Equitable.
Yann?
I would go for valuable.
Daisy?
Possible.
And I'll put mine for today, which is agency, because I think the most efficient and durable ones are those designed with and for those most affected. So thank you so much to our speakers for your candor and for these really rich, grounded examples and lessons. IHRB's report is available to download. We'd love you to share it, including by telling us what your one word is for what a just transitions means to you. And thank you for joining us. Bye for now.